Welcome to the Small Business Success Tips podcast with me, your host, Neil McDonnell. In this podcast, we strive to provide key information and tips that'll help small businesses like yours learn how to more effectively present your services to possible federal sector buyers. Our guest today is Emily Harman. She's the director of the Navy's Office of Small Business Programs. I've always said that she's the number one champion of small businesses in the Navy, and has been responsible for the Navy's Department of the Navy's small business programs and management of the small business professionals throughout the Navy. Now, I think it's awesome that Emily is joining us today because she is actually retiring at the end of this month, and this is May 2019. She's retiring at the end of this month and moving on to the next phase of her career. But I think it's awesome, Emily, that you have taken the time to just not have short-timers attitude, but spend it with me giving small businesses a little bit more advice on how we can be successful. So thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Neil. I'm really happy to be here.
We're sad to see you go. I've been doing a lot of videos and some other stuff talking to people about they need to find their influencers, and Emily Harman's mine, but you can't have her because she's leaving.
I might still be able to help when I leave, but not in the same way. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I don't mean to set you up for being sad, but there's this line in government contracting that when you're in, you're the best. When you're out, you're a pest. And
I know.
And it's one of those things that small businesses love to see the reckoning come. It's like, yeah, now that you don't have a Lockheed name on your business card, it's harder to get Lockheed to take your calls. But no, you've been awesome, very awesome. And so thank you for that. I'm excited to talk with you today about the Small Business Training Week that the government does. Just for the audience out there, I got aware of this, became aware of this a couple of years ago, I think last year heavily, when a lot of the 2018 videos for the Small Business Week were put out on YouTube. And it was a gold mine because in there was the government personnel talking about small business basically and how it fits in with the government. There was a lot of other stuff they talked about, but inside of there though, I got to see it with no filters. People were just having business conversations, training conversations, obviously. And I asked Emily to come on today and talk about the Small Business Week, Training Week for 2019 that just recently happened. So Emily, maybe you can share with us a little bit about the purpose of the Small Business Training Week from your perspective.
Sure. And I'm really happy that the Department of Defense started live streaming the Small Business Training Week last year. I think it's awesome. I think we need to be more transparent. Nothing we were talking about is top secret. The Small Business Training Week is something that the Department of Defense puts on each year for small business professionals, the government employees in the Department of Defense. And then we also train people that can come, our contracting officers, program managers. So we try to make it a conference where more of the acquisition workforce can come. So it's not just small business professionals talking to small business professionals. In order to be an effective small business professional, you really need to be able to interact with contracting officers, lawyers, program managers, and understand each other's pain points. And that's why I think it's good that, they all come. And this year, I think it was over 800 people came. So it was a pretty big turnout. We also have the procurement technical assistance centers come. And then the other organization that comes and participates is the Small Business Administration, because, we work very closely with the PTAC, and Congress wants us to work even more closely with the PTACs. And then we also work very closely with the Small Business Administration because they review all of our procurement. So it's great to get everybody in the room and get some training. And during that week, we also have an opportunity to have breakouts. For example, the Air Force had a breakout, the Department of Navy had a breakout, and the Army had a breakout. So at the Navy's breakout session, I introduced Mr. Jimmy Smith, who's taking over for me once I retire. So he was able to be there and meet all of our small business professionals and other acquisition workforce members that came. We also gave out awards and certificates to small business professionals in the Navy and the Marine Corps that are doing a great job. And we shared best practices, and we talked about key topics that are coming up, because some things that we need to talk about in the Department of the Navy, the Air Force may not need to talk about. We all take our unique, have our unique spin on some of the policies, like category management and stuff like that. So it's good to have a breakout session where we're able to talk about that. And then even beyond that, we have 10 buying commands within the Department of the Navy, and some of them have so many small business professionals that they can't all get together that frequently. So when we come together for training week, some of the larger commands have a breakout session where they can get together and just talk amongst themselves.
No, that's awesome. And I can imagine that's very valuable for these people who generally don't see each other throughout the year to come together.
Definitely.
Hey,
and we have, if you have turnover, some of them haven't met each other yet. So, you might have talked on the phone, but seeing each other in person and really getting to know, it's the personal connection that really helps work get done.
No, that's perfect. And I'm just writing notes on this because it's, for me, it's just such an awesome thing when people can come together and actually move to the next stage. I've looked at those topics and looked at the agenda, and I was really impressed with what's being taught internally. You were one of the speakers that were down there, and anybody wants to, I think you can find her video on Facebook as well. I think you reach it through the Navy's Small Business Office page, but certainly through the DoD page. But what was your topic, and what was the goal of what you were trying to share? Like, why did you choose that particular topic?
My topic was storytelling, how to tell a good news story, because one of my big pushes within the small business program, and same with the Department of Defense, is the small business program cannot just be about goals. It cannot just be about mandates and meeting a small business goal, because our customers, the warfighter, to be quite honest, could really care less if we meet a goal. With small business, they don't really care who delivers the product. They just want the product to work. And so when we approach our customers about the need to use small business, because the law does require it, and small businesses are, innovative, agile, and all of that. So there are definitely good reasons to use small business, but people tend to use the main reason as we have to meet our goal, and that's not a good reason. So what I was talking about was storytelling and the importance of telling stories, because you really can connect better when you tell a story. That's how you get to people's hearts, and that's how you influence change. And so as I was putting together my slides for my session, you might think I was lazy, but I really wasn't. I was thinking to myself, what's the best way to get this across? Because a lot of times in training, people are at that small business training week and they're sitting down and they're getting just inundated with PowerPoint slides. So my session was actually a breakout session. It wasn't for the whole audience, but people could come to it if they wanted. And we probably had a couple hundred people in that session. But when I put the slides together, I decided to just put an agenda together that covered, like, why storytelling is important, why good news stories are important, to whom do we tell these good news stories as a small business professional, because we have more than one audience, and then trying to get the audience to think about what does the person that we're talking to want to hear, what would resonate with that person, what language do they use. And so I just had after I laid out the agenda, I had blank slides, and I said, we're going to build these slides together. We're going to crowdsource the answers. And that got people more engaged instead of just sitting back waiting for me to tell them the answer. And I don't even have all the answers. So we did some good crowdsourcing, and then we put the slides together to share after the conference. So I thought that was a good way to approach it, because people that were definitely engaged.
No, that's perfect. And not to put you on on the spot, but to put you on the spot. Any stories come out of that? Like, did you hear any stories that are worth repeating, or did you happen to have a story that you were able to bring as an example that you can share?
Well, I didn't tell a whole story as an example. I used a book that was written by my high school classmate, actually. It's called Unleash the Power of Storytelling, Win Hearts, Change Minds, and Get Results. And my classmate is Rob Biesenbach, and I can give you his name later, and you could maybe put it in the show notes. But we just we didn't really tell stories in that training, but I did give some examples of a good news story some people, I had that on some slides at the very end, because some people when they hear story, they think, oh, I've got to write a whole long article. No, you don't. It needs to be really short. People's attention span is short right now. So you don't have to tell a whole story, but, what is it that's important to your audience? What was the effort that had to be done? How did a small business get it done? What was the name of the small business? And what's the benefit to the warfighter? So we put together a template within the Department of the Navy. The challenge is just finding these good news stories, because we have such a huge organization and we only have 76 small business professionals that are full-time. And I gave them some tips about how to track down a good news story. For example, we small business professionals review acquisitions at the beginning of the acquisition. So some of them are straightforward. It should be a small business set aside. It's for butts in seats, just companies that are not that that's not important, but companies that are providing people to help the government get its mission accomplished. But some of the things that we're doing are trying to, as we influence acquisition strategies, break something out so that small businesses can get a bigger piece of the pie, instead of having one big procurement, break it into smaller chunks. Or in some cases, we're convincing the customer successfully to take something that has always been full and open competition and set it aside for small business, or to take something that was once set aside for small business in the past and make it, for example, a hub zone set aside. And so when we influence a change in a strategy from the way things have been done in the past, I recommended that they make a little note of that and go back and follow up with the customer later. On any big procurement like that, where maybe the customer felt it was a little risky, go follow up with them. And may not be a good news story, but we still need to learn, because that is going to be the way that we can take what we learned from that and realize that maybe our strategy and our advice wasn't the best advice. And then that makes us better small business professionals in the long run. But small business professionals tend to work on getting something set aside, and then they move on to the next one to try to get it set aside. And what I was saying is we need to follow up with the customer at the end and pull that good news story out of them. And that's what I was trying to help them with. And so you can, have a little checklist so that you can go back, because sometimes it takes a year or two to get these contracts awarded, especially if we're involved early in the acquisition process. So you need a little tickler to make sure you go back and follow up. And then the other thing I told them was ask the small businesses for good news stories, or ask the large businesses for good news stories of where small is helping as a subcontractor. The key thing with that, though, is we can't take a good news story from a small business and just share it, because there's always like 3 or 4 sides to a story. So the small might be telling what they think is a good news story, but the customer may not think it is. But so you've got to validate it that it is a good news story. But smalls can help us by telling the story too.
No, I think that's a great idea, and I live and breathe on stories. Like in my role in the Hub Zone Chamber, I've done this off and on, and I'm getting ready to just make it a regular daily thing. But telling stories of Hub Zone companies that have won contracts out there. For me, it's less important to talk about how's the contract going. That's kind of the story you're telling. But for me, it's about, yes, here's a Hub Zone company that won this contract. And you always got to know what the goal is. For me, the goal is to get government contracting officers, personnel, whoever, to see win after win after win going to Hub Zones, instead of, typically traditionally it used to be more complaints, right? And it's like, no, let's tell the good news stories, because that's what people latch onto anyways. I love the idea, and I think it's a challenge to the people who are listening to this, is that you should be providing those leads for possible stories to the small business specialists or the small business community within the government. Because I think you're right. We can provide you way more stories, and then you filter out which ones are actually good for the government to tell.
Right. And the key to, think about the government customer. The government customer doesn't care as much that a Hub Zone won the contract, but they would care that a Hub Zone won the contract and delivered and had even a gave a better product or a better service, or even if it wasn't better, but they delivered early or they delivered on time, or the cost was down, or that they were easy to deal with. These are all things that in the end, the government customer cares about.
No, that's interesting, Emily. I hadn't thought of this. I tend to go to the the contracts that were recently awarded, but I might go back 2, 3, 4 years and find wins and slowly reach out to maybe the small business and say, hey, did you do a good job with the customer? Can we talk to the customer and start telling that story? Because
that's exactly it. Because the fact that they won it isn't really quite the story.
No, I love this company. They happen to be a hub zone. They came in, they knocked it out of the park for the mission. No, I see that. That's very thanks. I was bringing you on the podcast to provide other people tips, but now you're giving them to me as well. Hey, we
can always learn.
Oh yeah, no, you and I are on the same page there. Let me ask you a couple of questions just randomly put into this, but one is OSDBOs, right? I've always kind of been on the standpoint, and to me, you're an OSDBO, even though your title's different, right? You're the head of the department's small business program. I've always suggested to people that while it's nice to talk with Emily and she's a great person, they're the last small business professional you should be talking to, or really one of the last people you should be talking to, because of their role. Their role is a senior executive. It's not touching a particular opportunity. How do you feel about that? And if you agree, who would you suggest that small businesses as they're out there doing their homework on opportunities, who should they be talking to?
So I definitely agree with that. And I think the confusing thing for small businesses is that a lot of times it's me or the head of the organization that's out there doing the talking, so that at conferences, so then it would seem like that I would be the person that with whom you should engage. But it's really, the Department of Navy has 10 buying commands, and each of them have a director for small business. So the key is to figure out which of those commands buys what you sell, because I don't review those acquisitions, those buys. I have somebody, and so I don't need to know your capabilities. The small business professional at the command that's going to award the contract needs to know your capabilities, needs to know that your company exists. My office reviews larger procurements. I think it's over 250 million, and I have a guy on my staff that reviews them. But before he reviews them, they go through the small business professional at that buying command. So they are the one, that's where the rubber meets the road. They're the ones with whom you need to meet. They understand the culture of the organization. They understand what that organization's buying. So the times when you should call my office is once you've talked to the director of the particular command with whom you're trying to do business, and if they're not responsive or they're not responding to you, that would be a time to call me or call my office. If you're having trouble getting paid in a timely manner and you've done all you can at the command level and you think it needs to come to my attention, I can help with the payment issues. But I would, in most of those times, I'm going right back to the small business director at that command. And if you haven't talked to the small business director at that command, then you shouldn't be coming and talking with me. So that's one person that the small business professionals should talk to. Sorry, I'm at home and my dog is coughing.
No, I'm just letting the audience know that Emily is a real person just like you and me.
Yep, and I have a dog that coughs.
Right.
All right.
How insensitive is that dog that coughed during a podcast interview? Come on.
I know. Okay, and then the other organization that the small business professionals should talk to, and I saw you mention this on a video the other day, Neil, is the Procurement Technical Assistance Centers, the PTACs. They can help not only with federal government contracting, but with state and local contracting as well. And then you mentioned the Small Business Procurement Center rep. That's another person with whom you should talk. Contracting officers are good people to talk to, but a lot of times they are at the very end of the procurement process. So really, if you can get into the technical customer, that's a good place to start. And within the Department of Navy, all of the deputy program managers on our big programs are tasked with being a small business advocate, not necessarily a small business professional like I am, but a small business advocate for their program. And they're they know that part of their role is to talk with you. But I wouldn't recommend at first you go talk to the small business person at that command, because they can make sure you're ready to go talk with that person. Here's a story that I tell a lot when I speak. Once when I was at NavAir, a company came and met with me. I was the small business director at the Naval Air Systems Command, and that company that came to meet with me asked if we still do testing on this base at Pax River, and that's the main thing that we do there, one of the big things that we do. And so that tells me that that company had not done their homework, and I would not want that company to go meet with a technical customer, because then the technical customer is going to think that all small businesses, not just this one, but that all small businesses don't do their homework and they don't know what they're talking about. So when you're a small business doing business with the government, you're not just representing your company, you're representing people's impression, you're influencing people's impression on how all small businesses are. So keep that in mind.
But just to be a little confrontational on my podcast, which I never am, I like how with the small, if a small does something like that, all of us smalls are bad. But if a large loses a multi-billion-dollar contract or ruins a multi-billion-dollar contract, no one paints the entire large community, or excuse me, no one paints the entire company with that brush. They just paint that program office within the company with that brush. And they certainly don't paint the whole large community going, oh my God, Booz screwed up a project and ruined it for millions of dollars or billions of dollars. We're going to blame Lockheed and Northrop and Boeing and everybody else too. I'm like,
I feel your pain, Neil. I completely get it. And hopefully the culture will start changing. And I'm not saying that everyone thinks that way, but that's definitely a big risk right now. So, and program managers, especially in Department of Defense, are risk adverse. And then in some cases, yes, we definitely are just tied to these large businesses because of how we've bought in the past, because we don't own the data rights. But I think in many ways, we're definitely trying to get away from that and have open architecture. And I think in the future is bright for small businesses, in my opinion, because we'd like to have our systems more plug and play, like your iPhone. It's got a backbone that Apple controls, but everyone knows how to write an app that interfaces with that, or you can figure it out. So ideally, we should be able to get there with some of our systems and make it easier for small businesses to bring their products directly to the government.
Yeah, and I'm totally with you. I actually strongly, and this, advocate that small businesses stop complaining and stop blaming the government.
Right.
Because even if it's right, justifiable, it doesn't matter. It's not successful. If I was working in the Navy or the Army or HHS or something, and I'm retiring, I'm looking for where am I going? 9 times out of 10, I'm looking at going to work for Microsoft or Boeing or something, because I go, oh, there's a safe company. I can get a good job, be able to stay. And when I look to a small, I think it's riskier. It's for us to deny that as a small business community is to deny human nature or human way of looking at it. But I believe very firmly in data and evidence. And so it comes back to your story thing, right? If you can come with these success stories, if we can start showcasing more good work, if we can start doing more good work, if we can start policing our own that say, hey, don't go to the Navy to try to get a prime contract until you subcontract. So you know what it's like to work with the Navy. These are the things the PTACs, and everybody else say to us. And I think now is really the right time for us to start listening to you guys.
Right. So, one thing that you can do is, we just put on our website, on the Department of Navy Office of Small Business Programs website, some data, a way for companies to sort and kind of figure out who buys within the Department of the Navy and the Marine Corps, who buys what they sell. So when you go in and meet with a customer, you should be able to figure out, how you may not be able to figure it out down to like a program office, but you can figure out like the Naval Air Station at Pax River, how much do they use small businesses and what as prime contractors, and what do they use the small businesses for? Where are they using small business? Where are they spending money with larges? So there's some homework that can be done as well. And that data that we put on our website comes from the Federal Data Procurement System, which is available to the public as well. So you could also, just try to, if you're going to meet with the program office, and then the small business professional can help you with this, what is that program office's experience with small businesses? Have they used them in the past, and did they not work out? That's the point. That's my point, is you got to understand your customer, and understand where they're coming from, so that when you tell your story, it connects with them. And a story of, I'm a small business doesn't really, help. It's got to be more than that. And, I tell my small business professionals, you could be meeting all of your goals, and that's the story you tell. We're meeting our small business goals, but the small businesses could be failing on all of those contracts. They're not, but, what if they were? The fact that you're meeting your goals is not a good news story.
Yeah, no, you're right. It all comes back to the stories. I talked to somebody in the Navy, a contracting officer, who's just, being informal and, but talking about the hub zone impression in their particular program office. And they were saying, look, we awarded to a hub zone a while back, and this must have been 8 years ago, and it went horribly wrong. And the same people who were running the shop are still there, and they remember that. And yes, we shouldn't be that way. But if we all thought about it individually, we're the same way. If we go to a restaurant and we have bad service, we'll just remember that, even if it's completely changed and all the employees are gone. That corner restaurant, boy, it's the worst. And that's just human. Comes back to, that's human nature. We have to do our homework to learn about that. And I tell people too, move on. If it looks like you're not getting traction, just go somewhere where my phrase is, go where you're not needed. And I use that in the sense of performance. If someone's not hitting goals, you don't actually want to go there. You want to go to the place where they're hitting goals, because if you're a hub zone firm and you got your small business, you got tags, go where they're using those tags. If you try to go somewhere they never hit their goal, they're probably not going to hit it again this year. So
that's interesting, because it can be counterintuitive. I listened to a podcast it's called Don't Keep Your Day Job. And in that podcast, she talks about how some people are like hesitant to maybe start a coffee business or start another podcast or do something that somebody else is already doing. And her point in that podcast is, that's where you need to open up a shop, because that there's a demand. So just because there's a whole bunch of coffee shops doesn't mean your coffee shop wouldn't work, because there's a bunch, because there's a huge demand for coffee shops. And that's kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah, which, a lot of us have to, the ones who are going to be successful are the ones who can do that. Hey, speaking of that,
what you were saying is go to some, an organization that's already meeting their goals. That's kind of counterintuitive, but that means that they are looking for small businesses.
Oh yeah, like in the Navy, a big concern in the Navy, just so in your last week you can solve it. Is that the impression is that things just keep going to larges, even if it's $1 million or $2 million a year contract, still goes to larges because they're concerned about small. And it's like, hey, it's unfair. I'm like, you can call it unfair, or you can just move to the major buying command that actually is using smalls. Just because it's like going into the intelligence community or something, you can complain that if that you're not in there and so you can't get any work, but it's like, well, that's the way business is. It'll eventually change, but it certainly is not changing in a day or a year. So, coming back to your story as always, I think, is start getting those good stories in there, and maybe pretty soon you'll make the change happen. But I know you got another thing after this podcast, so I want to make sure we stay on track and wrap up. And we're doing well. I knew that you and I would just be able to chat through a lot of things. I wanted to ask you one last thing, though, is and this is the fun thing for you, and I gave you 5 minutes to think about this, is that, based on your career supporting government acquisition and especially the small business community in the recent history, what's one tip that you would want us, either one tip or one thing you would want us to pay attention to, in particular as it relates to being a small business that wants to be successful in the Department of the Navy?
Well, I know I probably sound like a broken record when I say this, but I say it because it still, unfortunately, needs to be said. Lead with your capabilities, not your small business size status, and what kind, that you're woman-owned or a hub zone or an 8A, so many people still come up to me or they send an email or whatever, and that's what they lead with. And you've got to lead with your capabilities and what makes you stand out.
No, I mean, I think you don't have to expand on that, and I don't think it's a broken record. I think it's exactly what we need to hear as we get out there. It's much harder for anybody in the government to say something like this, but I like saying that, look, they don't care that you're a vet. And then I move on to they don't care that you're a hub zone. Yes, individually they care that you're a vet, and we all say thank you for your service. And I'm a vet, you're a vet, right? Or you will be, and no, you are, so you're past. But the point is they care about the mission, and you've taught me that well. And so as I take the baton from you and keep running with it in the small business community, I'll be selling that as the number one tip that's out there is lead with your capabilities.
Good. Thank you.
Hey, I really appreciate everything you've done for the small business community. I just taken full advantage of this podcast and having you on to say that I know everybody in the small business community is so appreciative of not just you being out there and talking and sharing things, but you truly being for the improvement of the relationship between the Department of Navy and small businesses. You're not just trying to get us wins in there, and you're not just trying to get goals met. It's about knowing that we can support the mission, and you've been such an awesome advocate for that relationship between the government and small business. So thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Neil. And one other thing I want to say is, it would be great if companies could read the small business strategies that each of our 10 buying commands has on the website and engage with the command about that. Let the command know that they're being read and that you're paying attention to what they say they're going to do with small businesses and to create opportunities for small businesses.
No, that's perfect. And actually, it was funny earlier you had said something about show notes. And I think that's a different podcaster you're thinking about. I do the talking notes part. Getting down to writing actual show notes from it is a secondary task for me. But I think I will put in what you just said, right? The links to those strategies because they're good documents for people to read.
Awesome. Thanks, Neil. Thanks for having me on your show.
Oh, yeah. And I wish you well. I'm going to follow up with you after the podcast and ask if we could tell people where you're going next and the things you're doing. And I wouldn't mind having you back on for like a little plug of where you've moved on, because I know you're moving on to something exciting.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. All right. Thanks. All right. So as we wrap up this episode, I wanted to remind the listeners of a few things. First, click the subscribe button to make sure you're notified when new episodes are released. This also helps those of us who work on the podcast know that you're out there and listening. Second, if you find the podcast valuable and think others would, please share a note about us on LinkedIn or one of the other social media platforms. Finally, go ahead and get access to a lot more free content that I know you'll find valuable by visiting our website, www.hubzonechamber.org. Membership is free in there, but the content, it's priceless. I'm your host, Neil McDonnell. I thank you for listening to this episode and hope you'll join us again for other episodes. Remember, government contracting is not a secret. It's just a process.